Hello, welcome to another episode of Rustacean Station. I'm your host, Erlend. Today we have of course, special guest, as all our guests are. We have Erlend Sogge Heggen. Did I get that right? We just practiced before. Forgot it wrong. That's embarrassing. So he is the, I guess I can say, creator / idea man behind Fish Folk, which is a game written in Rust. It's been around for some time. It used to have a different name, right?
Yeah, previously we went by the name Fish Fight. But then recently, I guess like end of last year, we sort of rebranded to Fish Folk as we were starting to introduce several games under this one brand.
Why change the name? I'm kind of curious.
I think when we started to think about having multiple games as part of this larger fish world that we were establishing, we didn't want to be too tied up with this kind of fighting idea, because we were starting to play with games that didn't really have anything to do with fighting in general, like simple soccer games, for example, sports games of that kind. So we started to think about what it would look like to have a brand that was more about a world. And yeah, that fit in nicely with Fish Folk, which also just means people in Norwegian, where I'm from.
Yeah, I think that we have the same word in English. It probably came from Norwegian, I suppose.
Yeah. One way or the other.
So it works out quite well. Yeah, I see you. I'm just looking at the GitHub kind of org, and I can see your email is the contact email for that org.
Mm-hmm.
Because this is kind of interesting, right? So you are not a developer, is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, and the interesting part is you want to come on and talk about this, and of course this is all about Rust, right? But it's kind of interesting to also hear from the business side about how Rust has been either maybe a hindrance or even a positive for the project, right? And you came and found me particularly, which is interesting. So I'm guessing this must mean that it's been really good for you, that you really want to kind of spread the word saying, hey, this has been working out for me. And let me tell you why, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We talked a little bit about this, I think, when we came on I think it was just called the Rust Game Dev podcast. We did that about a year ago, me and the previous lead developer on this project, Alex. And yeah, the story remains the same. We thought, we were a little bit worried that maybe Rust would kind of hamper our ability to onboard new people, since it's perceived as the systems level language, like kind of like lower level, right? And it's not a secret that it's a little bit harder than kind of the average language either to learn. However, because of this quite remarkable feature of Rust of once you kind of have it working, it's just gonna generally stay that way. You can at least be much more confident in what you've created, that it's not gonna have to change a whole lot. And even if you have to change it, that's not gonna really be as much of a burden as with a lot of other languages. That has been a huge boon for us, and it has helped us take on newcomers with great ease, because that applies very neatly to them as well. If they get something working, then we can be quite confident that we can just throw it into the game and start playing with it. We don't have to concern ourselves too much with looking over our shoulders all the time of stuff that we're bringing into the game and then worrying that it's gonna come back to haunt us later, because a lot easier to keep some oversight on several different people with different standards coming into one place.
Well, I mean, there's that, right? The language itself is pretty good, but I have to kind of ask, because my understanding about Rust and game dev, of course it's possible, but there's not many like 100% Rust games. I mean, there's like Embark Studios, which is doing some stuff with Rust, but they have never released a 100% Rust game, as far as I know. I don't think there's even, maybe it has some pieces in Rust, I'm not too sure, but I know they still use like traditional C++ game engines for most of the game.
Yeah.
But you're doing this 100% Rust, is that correct?
That's right. Yeah, it's built on top of Bevy. We have our own kind of meta engine, if you will, that's called Bones on top of that for certain special features we needed, determinism and rollback networking. It kind of plays into our plugins infrastructure as well for modding. But it's all Rust, and it certainly took us a little longer than it would have otherwise. Like we could have made this thing in Godot and we would have had it done quicker for sure. But I don't think it would have had the same guarantees for long-term maintainability. And also we just have this bias for the Rust community. We just really love the vibe, and it's a great way to get in touch with really great engineers. I think the pros and cons kind of weigh each other out, that they kind of come out the same. But what you get with something like Godot, an established framework, is you can get to a prototype a lot quicker. But that was never the challenge for us, because this initial game we were doing, it's literally a spiritual successor of an existing game called Duck Game. So the design was already in place. So we didn't really need a lot of that quick iteration that you get from more traditional engines. Rust is still kind of catching up on that a little bit, but it was more important for us to have a really robust architecture that we can continue to build upon for a long time without worrying about technical debt. And Rust serves that purpose very well.
So you said this is based on Duck Game? Is that the one I see on Steam over here?
Yeah,
Why did you decide to base your game on Duck Game, though? Is it just a favorite game of your past, or?
that's pretty much it. Yeah, me and a buddy of mine 4 or 5 years ago now, we picked this game up kind of just as one of several other games over the past that we've just casually played for a bit. But this one just really stuck with us. It has been a regular part of our hangouts ever since we started playing it. And it has these modding capabilities as well, where you can make your own levels and start playing those for yourself. And once we started doing that, we kind of had our own little suite of levels that we had made, then it just really stuck with us. And that's kind of what planted the seed, because this game was officially discontinued by the solo developer Erlend, and we just felt like that was a real shame, because we wanted more of this game. We didn't really want to stop it. And we've been in touch with the original developer of that game, Landon, occasionally ever since. And he was always very supportive of what we're doing. And now he has even backed our Kickstarter campaign and is very on board with everything that's happening.
Oh, that's interesting. How come they stopped working on the game? I seen that they had an update about a year ago on Steam, at least.
Yeah, there's been some sporadic updates here and there just to kind of bring, it was mostly existing content that he needed to bring out to other platforms. But he's been kind of trying to wrangle himself out of the responsibility of that game for quite a while now, because like so many game developers, he has many other ideas in his head, and that game was a bit of a surprise success for him. It kind of took on more of a life than he expected it to. And he has been on record saying things like he never really was that into things like building community, for instance, and making it more long-term friendly in that sense. And that's kind of what we are all about. That's my background is in community management, so it seemed like a good way for us to continue the tradition of Duck Game in a more open and community centric manner, to do it the way we're doing it now.
Okay, well, when you talk about the community, I mean, what kinds of things would you want to have in this community? Is it just about sharing mods or creating mods, or is it like multiplayer, or what kind of community are you looking to build?
Yeah, it's both of those, but it's certainly, it has maybe the most to do with mods. And modding obviously is very naturally, it's a very natural coupling with the open source way of doing things. That's how I really got into games, or even tech in general, was through Warcraft 3 modding, I guess almost like 2 decades ago now. And it was always, over the years, I got to experience several other modding communities, for example, that of WordPress. And it was pretty remarkable to see Warcraft 3 and WordPress compared to each other in how they managed their modding communities. Because in Warcraft 3, they really just said, whatever you make here, we own it. Whereas in the WordPress way of doing things, and generally like the internet open web way of doing things, you just build on top of what others have created, and you still own what you are bringing to the table. And we want to see a lot more of that in the world of game modding as well. So that's kind of how we're coming at it.
Okay, that's interesting. I mean, when people are going to be making mods for this, how is it that you can vet these mods will be okay and not give a bad experience to the player? I mean, of course, if it's written in Rust, it doesn't mean it can't be performed badly or do something nefarious, etc. Right? I mean, you're not going to run into traditional errors such as like memory corruption, at least not so
Yeah.
commonly, right? So, what's kind of the thought process and how you can vet these kind of things?
Yeah, I think it's gonna look pretty similar to how other open source projects are doing it. Like, again, if you take WordPress, you have the open source WordPress project, but you also have WordPress.com, the WordPress hosted service. And that's effectively what we're going to be doing as well. There's going to be the commercial game that's out there for sale, but it's still an open source thing that others can hack around with as they please on their own computers. And so the split there is going to be on your own and in your own little environment and even like network of friends. You can apply whatever mods you want. We're not going to have any kind of control over that. But if you want to play mods essentially on the official Fishfolk servers through the official Fishfolk game that you get through Steam, Switch, whatever, then there's going to be some kind of curation going on our end, where we have picked the ones that, aren't technically dubious and are also just a good extension of the game.
I also find it quite interesting that you're not closed source, right? You're actually open source, or the source is available.
Yeah.
Now, what's the license that you have on that?
The game code license is just the standard Rust MIT Apache. And the way we minimally protect that in case of bad actors, though we haven't run into that as of yet, is that our art assets are licensed as Creative Commons only for non-commercial use. So anyone can use those assets to like prototype their game, submit, like release whatever they want with it for free, but they can't put a price tag on it and say, come buy my game with those assets unless they have talked to us first and come to some kind of agreement.
So literally somebody could just take the code, switch out the art assets, and then can sell it, I think it sounds like.
Yeah, it's a bit funny. We're waiting to see like if that happens. We've seen that occasionally been done to other projects before. But in a sense, for us, that's almost just going to be kind of proof that we're doing something right. And we always have the option of course, protecting ourselves a little bit more with ongoing development. It's not like we can change the license of the code that's already there. But if someone starts stealing our ongoing work, then of course we could start to limit a little bit of what we are just constantly releasing immediately out in the open. But we kind of just want to start with a total good faith approach, and we'll leave kind of the other mitigations for when we have to employ them. And we're kind of banking a lot as well on this being a very community driven game. So I just don't see it as very likely if someone just grabbed our project wholesale and tried to redistribute it as is, that they would get the same level of support that we're already getting, because people will just be more and more familiar with what Fishfolk is. And if they see kind of just a plain copy and paste elsewhere, I think they'd be less interested in that than participating in what we have.
Yeah, I can see what you mean. I mean, you can always, even if you can steal a Coca-Cola recipe, there's still a lot of marketing and other things behind it that make it difficult to copy and, overcome, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, I do like that you make the code, open source and people can kind of play around with it. How much work do you think people are committing that actually aren't part of like the core team or part of your umbrella?
You mean like how much are we getting from sort of outside contributors?
Outside, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, good question. I guess, let's say around 10%. But it's hard to draw the lines as well, because we do this thing where we work with a lot of younger developers, some of which are just coming out of school, for example, some are still in school, and we do these micro grants for them where they can do a certain gig of some sort, of some reasonable scope, and we'll pay them like anywhere between like $100 to $250 to just like get this job done. And for many of them, it's like their first time ever really getting paid for maybe even development, but especially to get paid for doing game development. And so a lot of these contributions that we get on our project are also part of this sort of program that we're doing. There's a bit of a gray area there of whether that is kind of part of the whole team or if that would be considered an external contribution, because that's also kind of an onboarding pipeline for us. Like the ones that stick around wanting to do more work of that sort, they just increasingly become part of the whole project as regulars and just another member of the team.
I'm kind of curious about how that actually works, right? So are you working with like a university directly, or how do you get to know like who's coming from a university that is, would like to kind of get their feet wet and enjoy some Rust? And how do you know like who would be that one, and how do you do like the commercials for that? That sounds like quite a bit of like legal work, because you are an entity, right?
Yeah, sort of like parts are established and others aren't. Like Fishfolk is trademarked and so forth, but We still haven't fully like incorporated. We are aiming for this like co-op structure. But back to your point about, yeah, where are these people coming from? I think it's like at this point roughly a 50-50 mix of just inbound from our GitHub and Discord being out there, and the other half has been me finding people on GitHub, like seeing some person like, oh, this person is working with Rust, they're working with games, they're working with Bevy, they're even doing some kind of platformer experiments. I'll just get in touch and say, hey, by the way, here's this project we're doing. Seems like we're working on some similar things. So if you'd like, come hang out with us and yeah, see if you'd like to get involved. And we almost prefer not knowing almost like anything identifiable about people, at least like to start with. So I've several times had the experience of doing one of these gigs with someone, and I'll go, well, like, I'd love to get you paid now. And they'll go, yeah, I don't really like have a PayPal or anything yet. Like, I'm not old enough. So we get to, yeah, work with just like brilliant people who are still just in their teens, but are still so talented that they can start contributing to a project like this already. And it's so fun to work with them and not even know upfront age, gender, nationality, any of it. Like, it's fun to learn about that stuff over time when we get to know each other better, but it also feels like a nice way of digital interaction to initially just know each other strictly as participants in this project without other unnecessary identifications to start with.
That's pretty good. So it's basically just strictly like a, what do you call that? Merit-based, right?
Yeah.
Now, how does your process work for finding these kinds of people in terms of like, are you actually going out there finding them, or is it that your developers do, or like, because I mean, it seems like you have some idea of some technical stuff, but you said you're not coding at all, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of a weird, a little bit of a weird one like that. Like, been in contact with developers for so long now, so I can speak tech quite fluently. I'm just not gonna be the guy who puts a program together for you, but I can look at a GitHub project and check out the config toml file or something, right, in the project that shows the dependencies, and I will recognize how this thing is put together, right, like the components that make this thing. So that's kind of the level of the stack that I have an understanding of, and that's enough for me to look at what people are working on and understand if what they're doing is relevant to what we are doing. And so nowadays, I'm not doing any kind of direct outreach at all to developers, but in the early stages of the project, that was pretty much all I was doing. That was how we were getting all of our early contributors. And so I would literally go to GitHub, specify the search to be strictly for Rust projects, and then just search with terms like game and platformer and 2D. And yeah, all the most incredible people would just pop up all the time. And as long as someone had an email available on their profile, I would just casually reach out and say hello.
Okay, that's pretty interesting. But I kind of wanted to start like a little bit further back, right? So you got this idea to start this. Did you basically self-fund this? I mean, kind of what was your method for kind of starting off and saying, you know what, I love this game, I want to do something similar. Like, what was your kind of first step?
Yeah, the very first step was a prototype that I made as part of an employment I had with a company called Heroic Labs, who make sort of hosted multiplayer infrastructure for games. And I think practically part of my way into the company was me just sort of pitching them on this, at the time, fish fight idea that they should make this game as part of demonstration of their product to kind of hook it up to their networking infrastructure and make a tutorial out of it. At this point, I had already been pondering this project for a while, and this just turned out to be a nice way to get it started. So initially, it was basically funded by this company, but a couple, I guess like 6 months in of casually working on that, I parted ways with that company and decided to go fully independent with the project. So we got me and Fedor at the time, the maker of Macroquad and Macroquad, who was working with me on it. Yeah, we got permission to just like continue the project as an independent entity, totally separated from Heroic Labs, where I got it started initially. And so from that point onwards, I've been personally funding the project, yeah.
Okay, so your self-funding is, how do you do the funding? Are you Prince or something? I'm just kind of curious because it's not cheap to do games, right? To fund games.
Yeah, No, and I love talking about this. Like, I think financing is very under discussed in these circles. I think that's definitely one of the reasons I wanted to get on here, because I find it really interesting. And we've been very cost efficient for sure. We've spent roughly the same amount that we're now getting from the Kickstarter, which is like 15,000 euros slash USD. I think they come out to roughly the same these days. So that's been roughly my investment as well, as part of basically these minor sprints of sorts with the developers ranging from juniors with these kind of micro grants to more experienced ones where it'll be up to like maybe $1,000 on average, like in a month. And yeah, it's all part of this idea that whatever tier you're working at, you're also a part of this project. So there's kind of a big social contract involved, and being open source helps a lot with that, because it's not like I can just take this project and suddenly disappear. And also everything I'm doing in this space, it is extremely reputation based. So this game would really fall apart if I turned out to just be a fraudster. So these payments that I'm doing, they're never representative of a person's, what would you call it, kind of like market value, that kind of, yeah, slightly silly term we use sometimes. Because obviously a lot of these are very talented engineers, and sometimes they're even already working in existing companies that would pay them a whole lot more than I ever could. But the kind of big sell that I can give is that the money is really just a way to prove that I'm serious about this thing, but it's not really meant as a perfect reflection of their contribution to the game. So that comes in with the co-ownership of the game, where we want this to be co-owned by practically anyone who has worked on it, but especially anyone who's been a core contributor is gonna have really equal ownership of this thing, just as much as I have. I have no intention of being a majority owner of this thing.
Okay. So, I mean, the code is out itself is underneath Apache, right?
Yep.
But how does the rest of the org work? Because you obviously have some legal work. Are you registered as like a specific charity or something? Or how's the rest of
No,
it?
so none of that yet. So I'm just like, what's it called? Single person corporation, something like that. Just registered here in Norway. And there's no other such registration yet. And that will just come in time. Like, probably now that we've got a Kickstarter that has actual money coming in from elsewhere, as opposed to me just giving out money to others, now it's going to be more important to have, yeah, some of these more formal registrations to get those going. But we quite intentionally didn't want to do too much of that up front, because I've had that experience before of getting into the formalization of any kind of organization too early, and that takes up a lot of time and energy, and we just wanted to focus on getting this game made initially. So we've just been counting on the fact that we can build trust with each other, and me being a fairly public persona in how I'm building this whole project makes that a lot easier to work with.
Yeah, I was just looking at your Kickstarter to kind of see what some of the rewards are. It's just quite interesting. And you already have quite a few backers. You even have somebody
Yeah.
backing you at 7,500 euro and the one before that. Like,
Yeah,
it's pretty amazing.
that's kind of, we did not see that one coming. As of today, are fully funded, and that is obviously in large part because of this one major backer who hopped on to our max tier, which basically gives them like the title of executive producer. And we're just, yeah, gonna be having some chats from here on to figure out how we might do something together in a way that's aligned with both of our mutual projects. So there's more to be said soon about, yeah, what's been going on with these incoming large pledges.
But you said both of our mutual projects. So it's somebody else who's also in a similar space as you?
Yeah, there's someone who's also working in Rust. I haven't checked the numbers very closely yet, but I'm pretty sure that the biggest kind of community that we've been backed by has been the Rust community. So there's a lot of people out there who just really enjoy seeing an open Rust project of this caliber. And so we've certainly seen a lot of backers from the Rust ecosystem.
So the mega backer is also in Rust, you're saying? Just want to make sure I heard you correctly.
Yep.
Okay. Are you allowed to say who it is, or that's a secret?
Oh, I'm sure I'm going to be talking about it more very soon, but I haven't talked enough with them yet to know what they are comfortable sharing. But yeah, that's all of that is going to be very public.
Well, I guess if he has executive producer credit, you'll probably see that on the game at some point. Well, actually, I kind of want to go back to the Rust part because I feel like we're talking about a lot of high levels, and it's good to hear. And I have so many questions about that. But since we are a Rust podcast, we should probably bring it back down to the Rust part. What I did want to talk about is kind of like the ride, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Macroquad, is Macroquad the one that has not been worked on anymore? Or am I remembering wrong?
I haven't checked on it in a while. I guess it went into maybe like a quieter period, but
I know one of the game engines went to a state of like no more working on it. I could have sworn it was Macroquad.
It looks to be like Fedor is still regularly committing.
Because like, if you have Macroquad and you sound like you had the creator of Macroquad kind of working with you, like why change from Macroquad? What was the thought process? How was the game at that point? And yeah, there's so many questions about that because it's a big change, right? When you're switching game engines, I don't know if you're a fan of FPS, but Duke Nukem Forever is super famous for changing game engines a lot, which have obviously caused huge delays.
Yeah. It's certainly been a source of delay for us as well, but it kind of had to happen. So we've gone through 2 major transitions, though actually I think we've rewritten the game 4 times because first it was me and Fedor doing the prototype as part of the Heroic Labs project. So that was me essentially like hiring him as a consultant to then work on the game initially. So that was its own thing. We made a tutorial out of that, but that was then kind of left to Heroic Labs to do with as they wished. So when we wanted to go independent, then an initial kind of rewrite happened, but that was still all Macroquad. Yeah, I don't think like anything major changed, but it was still kind of done from scratch again, with Fedor now kind of making it with the intention of doing it as a more well-architected, maintainable game. So a year or so into that, Fedor decided he wanted to work more on his own games. I probably should have seen it coming earlier because he's like a proper game developer. Like he really wants to design a new novel game. And I don't think I had made that clear enough to him about what we were doing here, which was that the main innovation of our work initially with what's called Fishfolk Jumpy, the game that is being based off of Duck Game, is that we're doing an existing game, but doing it openly. And that's our main challenge with this initial iteration of a game that we're starting out with. Whereas Fedor was more of the mindset of he wanted to create something new, which I totally get, but that's kind of where we eventually parted ways. So when he left the project, we essentially had an opening there for a new lead developer, and we already had someone who had been hanging around doing quite a bit of work with us called Alexander, a fellow Norwegian. And so he hopped on board and we just continued with Macroquad, but we built a sort of custom framework on top of that, built by Alex to kind of accommodate our modding ambitions. And then eventually, that was, I think, like it was towards the end of the COVID pandemic. And he had been enjoying, same as a lot of other people, just like a simple welfare check, and they were fine with him, like doing fishfolk work in the meantime. But then came the time when he had to get some work again, had to find employment. And initially we thought he could balance that all right, and we tried it for a while, but eventually it just turned out it just wasn't, he didn't have the bandwidth available any longer. And so then we were a little bit stranded for a bit, really wondering like how we were gonna continue this thing. And when we initially started the project, Bevy was not nearly as far along as it is now. So it was on our radar, we were aware of it, but when we were evaluating it, Macroquad was easily the better option. Also, obviously, because Fedor was affiliated with the project, so it made it really simple to get something built quickly and easily. But much later on in the process of the game, Bevy was looking more like it is today, an incredibly popular project with tons and tons of people involved with it, a really strong community, and a fairly mature engine as well. So there was another developer around who probably knew our project the best, and I basically just put it to him, like, if you were gonna make this project your own now and then continue development from here as the new lead, how would you like to do it? And Bevy was ultimately his choice. And the big difference that I'll point out, because as we were saying a little bit before starting the call, people in the Rust community, in the game dev community, they can get a little bit tribal. They want to talk about which engine is better. And we've really had the experience of it doesn't really matter as long as you have one or multiple good developers working with you and they're comfortable with the tooling they're using. You're going to get good games made no matter what you're using, especially if you're dealing with some of these quite mature frameworks or engines that are around in the Rust game dev community now. And Macroquad and Bevy they've both certainly been around for quite a while now, and they've had time to settle. And so the main difference with Bevy is really for us just the community around it, the amount of people, because even now we're less concerned than before. If suddenly our lead developer became unavailable, we're still made with Bevy. So there's going to be loads of people around who know how to work with Bevy code. And that wasn't quite as much the case with Macroquad. That's what made it a little bit more difficult for us to find someone else to pick up the reins when we needed to get a new lead for the project to continue it. So Bevy, just by being more mainstream and by being the most popular Rust engine around, that just makes it a safer bet for someone like us who we're going to be in this for the long haul. Like, this game is going to continue to be in development for several years, even after it's first been released. So it feels very right now.
Well, what I think is also interesting too is, so you started working with Bevy. Did you find any like difference in terms of Bevy versus the Macroquad? Like, was it better overall? Was it just about the same and just kind of, more people in the pool? Like, what was the result of the switch?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak a lot to that. You'd have to talk to Ziklag, the lead dev. But I think in short, there's quite little difference. The main one being the usage of an entity component system in Bevy versus, there not being one in Macroquad. That's kind of the main difference. But from what I've heard from developers, there's just, there are trade-offs with both. And I think most simply put with Macroquad is that it does try to be a little bit simpler in every way, but especially in like its dependencies, but also just in what it makes available to you with the Rust language. It kind of tries to streamline the initial experience a little bit, so it's easier to immediately pick up. Whereas there's a little bit more to learn upfront with Bevy, coming with an entity component system.
All right, so you made a switch over to Bevy. At what point did you realize that, okay, we need to actually build something on top of Bevy? Bevy just doesn't have enough of kind of a structure for us.
Yeah, that was because of our multiplayer implementation. And that has gone through perhaps even more iterations than the engine itself. It's a really tricky subject, and not a lot of people can call themselves experts in it. We're mostly just figuring out as we go. And I think we've kind of bounced back and forth between a peer-to-peer implementation and a client-server implementation. And now we've kind of come full circle back to peer-to-peer again. And so through initial experiments with what we were trying to do in the peer-to-peer and also rollback model, regular Bevy, it didn't work for us. I think the main reason was something to do with determinism. So we needed an extra layer there for the rollback networking to work. And the reason we wanted to do rollback networking is because it's this kind of famous way to do fighter games where twitchy, fast-paced games can still work in an optimal manner in online play, as long as you have very few players involved who can kind of be strictly in sync with each other.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I'd never heard of that before. Looks like it has another name, Good Game.
Yeah, GGPO is like the original.
Yeah, Good Game,
framework.
Peace Out.
Yeah, something like that.
That's interesting. I mean, but also, like, I'm just thinking, so it's a P2P connection, right?
Yeah.
Like, what kind of thing? Because I'm just thinking, like, if you're going to play this P2P, there's no server that does negotiations in between. It's just somehow you connect peer to peer. I'm not. How does that actually work?
Yeah, I mean, I'm also way out of my depth here, but I believe we've got this kind of proxy involved. We have some kind of matchmaker. So it is this hybrid in a sense, but we are also, it's still not completely settled how we're going to do this, because we feel comfortable with the foundation we've got in place, but it's still a little choppy. So there's clearly something that we have yet to do perfectly right in how we're doing our netcode. And I suspect we might have to do something a little different with this middleman where we have, in order to get people connected initially, so that it's purely peer-to-peer when they get to playing.
Yeah, I'm just wondering how, like you're probably gonna have to run some servers to make that happen, right? How do you plan to monetize that? Because that's a monthly cost, right?
Yeah, but that is the idea, that we just need to run some kind of very cost-effective matchmaking server, and the actual play that is strictly peer-to-peer, with people just using one another's computers and connections to play with each other. And that, yeah, that is a big reason why we wanted to do the peer-to-peer design as well, because we kind of get to bypass a lot of those hosting concerns where it just creeps upwards the more popular you get, and it's kind of a trap of its own.
Yeah, definitely. Because I mean, you're going for basically like a one-time license fee, and then people just continue to play, right?
Yeah, and if we had to change this again to somehow be more server based, then yeah, that might mean we'd have to change up our business model a little bit as well. Like, we're open to that. Like, the way we do that is the same as we've always done it. We're just going to openly talk to everyone involved in this, and just say, like, new constraints showed up. We have to change our tack a little bit. But I don't really think that sort of thing is a problem, as long as you communicate what's going on clearly to your players. Like, these are rational people who understand generally quite well how games work and how they are sustainable. So as long as you're just talking to your players, I think you can always figure this kind of thing out without it being some kind of rug pull effect.
Yeah. All right. So you start working on this new thing. I mean, this sounds kind of odd to kind of build something on top of something already, because you said it's Bones ECS, but ECS I think was already kind of a big piece of Bevy to begin with. No.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could tell you how
Okay.
this thing works.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's definitely best saved for a second conversation with our lead dev, because it was strange to me too to have kind of our, yeah, so we do have this sort of a minimal ECS that lives on top of the Bevy engine. But I don't think the two different entity component systems are kind of communicating with each other. I think it's more, we're using Bevy and Bevy ECS for engine things, and then we're using our own little ECS for essentially game mechanics, like anything more game specific. But again, like,
Okay.
yeah, take all of this with a big grain of salt, because
I understand.
yeah.
Yeah, it's just kind of interesting to to build something on top of Bevy, but I mean, I guess Bevy is also kind of, I wouldn't say bare bones, but maybe a little bit. There's more of a Lego piece set to it, right?
Yeah, it's still very much an engine, like, first and foremost, just for like really, really foundational game features, just like painting stuff on screen. Like, it starts you off there. It's nowhere close to the Godot and Unities of the world, where it kind of even brings along a bunch of mechanics for you. There's hardly any of that still in Bevy. It just, in a sense, it's still almost like a build your own engine toolkit. Like, that is still what most people are doing these days. Is they're not so much building games, they're just building some kind of prototype for the engine. And so you're just ending up with all kinds of graphical demos and, yeah, other demos of just like engine features.
Okay. All right. So after you built the engine, you open sourced it, obviously. Do you know if anybody's actually using the engine besides you?
We've got some people now who are starting to use it. There's been sort of murmurs about it for quite a while, but now we've got a fairly long time regular contributor who's also using it for his own game. Which, on that note, just a fun little tangent, what he's working on is also a really fun project where he's helping us make a level randomizer, where it's built on this whole very mathy thing, wave function collapse. I don't know if you've heard about it. It's this, some kind of technique to do matching of neighbor tiles, for instance. And yeah, he popped up some months ago showcasing some little thing he was doing on the Rust Reddit forum. And I got in touch with him saying, like, we've been pondering something along these lines for a while as well. And for the past several months now, he's been casually tinkering with this prototype of a tool that allows us to have initially modders, level editors, just make their own little level in our level editor. And then there's this little button that just says randomize. And so it'll take that existing map you've made and then just shuffle things around a bit so that you can make a map, but then you can just see some immediate variations of it as well with the click of a button. And this is one of those really fun things that I would argue is a lot easier to get done in Rust, because Rust is very good at more complicated systems. It also just appeals to people who enjoy making complicated systems. And yeah, it's just like a really fun story of this guy just showed up in the community and we got in touch. And now we've got a working prototype of a fairly unique feature that is also very generative for modders themselves, because now they can just take their existing creations and kind of immediately remix them on the fly.
Okay, that's pretty cool. I mean, how far along is the project right now? Like, I mean, obviously it's not on Steam yet, and you just closed Kickstarter. Are you looking to put this onto the store like in 2024 or at the end of this year or in a couple of years?
I would say for sure at the end of this year. It is really weird to talk timelines and deadlines, because I was having this same conversation like last year around this same time, and I was basically saying like any day now we're gonna just be out there and ready to go. And of course, like, yeah, stuff happens, timelines change, but it is looking very good now for a store release this year. And our first target is definitely gonna be the Steam store. We're so happy to see the Steam Deck being really successful, because that gives us an incredibly easy avenue into the console market as well, because that's generally how it goes, is they want to see some existing success already. If we can not only be successful on Steam but also be successful on the Steam Deck, then that sets us up very nicely for deals with the Nintendo, Xbox, PlayStation.
Yeah, I mean, this also shouldn't be too difficult, right? I'm not too sure how it all works, but what I understand, there is some Steam mapping, Steam input mapping you can do, but also you can also act like a native controller, so shouldn't
Yeah,
be too
with
hard.
Steam, it's super easy. Steam is wonderful like that. The consoles are weird because you have to get like these proprietary dev kits, and usually just to get your hands on them, you have to go through some whole process. And we tried that already once with a Switch and got rejected. I don't know right now what the state is with Xbox and PlayStation. Could have gotten simpler. I'm not sure. But yeah, it's still kind of a big question mark to what extent Rust games are also compatible with these platforms. I'm sure it's getting there, but I don't even know for sure like how straight out of the box that experience would be. But I'm confident we're gonna get there though, and that's again why the Steam Deck is so nice, because being a totally open platform and also just essentially being a Linux machine, it's just such a risk-free way to start everything off. And it's also just the most kind of mod-friendly anyhow, too, being a mostly open platform itself.
I mean, yeah, you can basically just sideload it, right? Worst case,
Yeah,
just so you can see how
yeah,
it
yeah.
goes.
Like if even they didn't want us in the stores, like we'd still find a way on there. But also to come back to your question about like where the game is at right now, like it is fairly stable, and like you can play it locally, no problem. We've even got bots that you can play against, although currently they're a little bit like too, they're so simple that they're really really good. They will just like run at you fearless and gun you down. So we're working on dumbing them down a little bit. We need to slow them down a bit and make them do some more human-like mistakes and such. But the game has been quite ready for a good while now, but the biggest missing piece is probably the networking, so that we can also have online play. That is obviously a pretty magical feature of its own, because it has these viral properties of once you get to start playing something online, then you can also start sharing it with others to play it with you. So that's gonna be a big tipping point when that is properly in place. But it's already very playable if you just want to download it and try it out. We've still got quite a bit of polishing to do, some tweaking of the controls to make them feel even better and such. But it works.
Yeah, I mean, from now till end of the year, it seems like a lot of work involved. But I guess probably the biggest stopper is probably the monetary, right? Because you have to, people need to find time to live, but also like work on this, right?
Yeah.
So I guess, because we're kind of approaching the end of our time. So I'm kind of curious. I mean, are you looking for like a shout out for people to come take a look, try it out, and if they're interested, contribute?
For sure, always. We've very intentionally tried to position ourselves as a very contributor friendly project. And I think we've been very successful at that. We have a large amount of contributors who have been involved with us over the years. And there are some pretty easy, specific things that you can get started with as well if you want to poke at this thing. Like it's a pretty large project at this point, but there are specific things to work on. Usually the easiest way to start is to make some kind of item or a weapon for the game. And we have a whole little tutorial already written out for how to do that. And otherwise, you would just look at like starter issues available on our GitHub for similar things to do. But most importantly, to just anyone who is interested in what we're doing and wants to get involved, the Discord server that we've got is definitely the best way to just poke your head in, start asking around. We've got lots of people who are super friendly, super good at what they do. So we're always happy to field questions from newcomers. Like that's a big part of what we want to do, is also have this educational value for people getting started in game dev and in Rust in general.
Well, I'm also kind of curious though too, is if you want to work on this, what would be kind of the way to do it? Do you have some kind of contributor sheet that they need to sign, like a pledge or something or anything like that? Because I know some projects, they actually require that you sign something to say, okay, the work I'm doing is going to be not mine or something, and
Yeah.
this kind of thing.
Yeah, no, we don't have any of that. Maybe we will if there are certain things later that we have to use a different type of license for. But since it's all MIT Apache now, there's no need for it. Like they own the code that they're contributing as much as we are. So the general understanding is just that if you have done any kind of significant work on this thing, we will figure out some way to turn that into real partial ownership for you of this project that you have contributed to. Again, this whole thing of open source making social contracts easier, how that works out is we have this really easy record of work there, in that there's a Git log that says this person did this thing, and that allows us to move forward without having to get a whole bunch of formalities involved and signing contracts of who's entitled to what, because the history is already there. And so we can always look back at it later when suddenly it comes time to distribute something, whether it's revenue coming in or some sort of share of ownership in the company. Then it'll be time to look backwards and then just start talking to people of figuring out what people reckon they're owed.
Okay. Yeah, I guess now would be the time to kind of have the shout outs. I think the Kickstarter is still open, so if people still want to contribute, obviously you're open to that, right? In terms of like monetary and backing it.
Yes, definitely. It's open almost for a whole month still. We reached our funding goal way earlier than we expected, but we're gonna be adding stretch goals to it very soon. We're still figuring out exactly how we want to do that, but definitely one really simple part of that is gonna be, we're just gonna say for every like 1K or 1.5K or something that we get now, we're gonna make prototype for an additional game to be added to the bundle of Fishfolk. So for example, one of these old school volleyball games or soccer games, for example, like any other, like any fun couch co-op or couch local play arcade style game that plays well with 4 characters of the art style we've got is gonna be a possible contender for one of these other games that we pick up. So we might even try to figure out some way to put that up to a vote somehow, to say like, which game do you want us to work on next, to try it out in the Fishfolk format.
And then finally, obviously, if they want to come contribute, it should be github.com/fishfolk, I believe is the name of the org, right?
Yeah.
And then in there, they can contribute to the engine, which is called Bones. And then I think you only have one game right now called Jumpy, is that right?
Yeah, well, Jumpy is our flagship game. That's by far the one that is the furthest along. But we also have at least 2 other games, both in Rust and Bevy, that are functional. The first is Punchy, which is a beat 'em up style game, which is, quite far along. We've almost kind of finished a completed prototype there with like a full sort of stage to punch your way through. And the second one that is still a bit more in the prototype stage, but it's still like a playable game that you can download already. It's called Bombi. And that's quite simply just, we're starting off with the Bomberman format, but we're just gonna use that as an initial starting point and then, play with whatever feels right in the fish way of doing things to make it a brand new game.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, is there anything else that I missed before we wrap up?
I mean, I think that's it. It's just it's a lot of fun to be doing this in the Rust community and ecosystem. I think it's a great place to be. There's a lot of incredible people involved in this space. It's a bit of an odd time right now. There's this minor kerfuffle going on in the Rust leadership. But I think there's no reason for concern. I feel comfortable that we're going to figure this out and keep the language going strong a long, long time into the future. So just happy to be involved.
That's great to hear. And I'm happy that we're finally going to have, I'm hoping this will turn into like a mainstream game that is 100% Rust. Because as far as I know, I don't know of any. If there is any, just guys, let's let me know.
There are a couple. But we're hoping to, certainly join that catalog and, have a unique voice in this space.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you for coming on. Maybe after your game launches for a while, I can hear, what was the feedback. And also, if you like, we can also bring one of your devs on and kind of talk a little bit more deeper about the use of Rust and how it's been.
For sure. Yeah, let's try and make that happen.
Awesome. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you.